When I was working in science festivals, there was this problem that we had within public engagement on science festivals. And it's a problem that hopefully we'll be able to outline with this Mentimeter. So, if you haven't already, if you use your phone and go to menti.com, and you can put in, it'll ask for a code, you'll need to put spaces. And the first one, a lot of you have done it already, but it is in real time, but we'll get all the stats, why not? We are big scientists, apparently. And then you can agree or disagree, so just the binary, however you want to interpret it, that you are sporty, arty, or sciencey. And again, completely up to you whether you define that as something professional or not, or interest, or some sort of character trait of you. I'll give you a few more minutes to do that. What do you want?
So excited.
The real time is actually before you actually sign off the talk. 31 seconds, maybe that'll work.
I'm so sorry.
Okay, so this is not a perfect system, but it's between 0 and 1. So, for example, 50% of you are saying that you identify sporty, or 40% of you. Oh, 50%! Too soon? Yeah. 60% of you are identifying as arty, and 80% of you identify as sciencey, however that you want to define that, which might not be a surprise given that we're in the LGBTQ in STEM event. Now, how do you think that might compare with the UK population?
Sporty.
Less? Less? Okay, so
More sport.
let's have a look. So, this is work done from the British Science Association, culture tracker, but probably a couple of years ago now. And they did it on a kind of representative study of people around the UK, controlling for the things that you might control for. And sporty would come up to, do you think it's as high as 50%? Leading question, that's a lawful question.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah? Cool. Arty. So I think arty for us was 60%. What do you reckon? Higher or lower?
Lower.
20?
Lower.
40? 18. 18. Very specific, very good. Nailed it. Nailed it. And then finally, sciencey. What do you reckon? 10%, 20, 5% compared to our 90, was it? Or 80? Yeah, we're 80. Interesting. So, I guess there's 2 points I kind of want to make here. Firstly, what's interesting is that these aren't mutually exclusive, and actually they did some follow-up work suggesting that actually the more likely, if you're more likely to identify yourself as arty, you're also more likely to identify yourself as more sciencey as well. And then the second point is who is in the room. And that's really the big question that we had when we were working in a lot of different types of science festivals. Now, this is not the same for all events, for sure, but we do have a problem within science communication, science education, and certainly actually in the broader political sense too, that we are in echo chambers. We like preaching to the converted. And that's, on some level, perhaps, is fine and justifiable, and it's great to have spaces where we can all unite on single things, but this might be a bit of a problem. So if we go into the next Mentimeter, let's see if this works. Right, a wee bit more controversial. So you can now use your phones. It should be the same code. It will probably updates, I believe. And again, it's just a binary, agree, disagree. Same-sex relationships are just as valid as heterosexual ones. The UK should leave the European Union, controversial. And I'm degree educated, that obviously is not a political opinion, hopefully you know that. But what I would say is, you know, this is anonymous and interesting. I guess actually, I'm only going to judge you on one of these. That's the first one.
I'm a bit worried about reversing that.
Yeah, always it's swap over. Sorry, that's my bad.
But no, that's really equal. So now I kind of want to be serious just so it's...
Maybe it was that way.
It might be because the balls are mixed. I don't know. This is science in action. it doesn't go quite as you planned, but that's okay.
When we put these in.
I think I got the reflection. Oh,
Oh yeah, no, you probably got them the wrong way around. Okay, that's cool. Still need to know like about it. If only all those were disregarded after that type of thing. So, well, I think the point I was trying to make here is probably quite obvious. I would like to believe that if I set the parameters the same way as the previous question, perhaps more, this would be higher, that same sex results are a wee bit more valid, or just as valid as heterosexual ones. You'd probably hope that's 100%.
Not as well.
Interestingly, for Brexit, who knows? Again, you know, and degree educated, interesting. So 40%, but again, these are nonsense figures. But let's compare them to the general population. So, based on 2012 YouGov, how many people do you think agreed that they believe same-sex relationships are just as valid as heterosexual ones? 60, 70? 50%? How optimistic, how pessimistic are we feeling? That's excluding the don't know. There was 11% that don't know. But yes, 70%. And that's 2012. So I'd hope that might change. You probably know in 2016 what the Brexit referendum result was. 51.9%. Lots of, as I said, those quite it probably will be very different today, and if there's the same amount of mismanagement of that test, then you know maybe it should have been. Interesting. And then degree educated. What do you reckon? 20? 30?
80.
80?
Oh. Yeah, again.
So again, it's the same point. So not only are we thinking about the characteristics, but also perhaps our political opinions as well. And the reason why I combine these together is I think it's, you know, Amy mentioned, I think, well, these are all connected in some interesting ways. The British Science Association did some research. Well, there's more of a census, so it wasn't quite research, but what they did find was that there was a small correlation between, again, if you're more likely to engage in arts or feel like you're arty, you're more likely to engage in science. And then they also did ask people's voting intentions when it comes to Brexit. And again, with very little, I'm not going to comment too much on it, but if you were more likely to consider yourself sciencey or arty, then you're also more likely to not have voted for Brexit. Now, it wasn't a statistical test, that's really important to say, so it wasn't a sociological study, it was an interesting census result. And so, by no means am I suggesting that we just need to give people more science and arts, and then it will change the Brexit persuasions. But I do think it addresses an interesting point that actually, especially when it comes to education as well, that there are obviously, there's a connection between your engagement, your participation in culture, and that has very real political consequences. And so, with that in mind, and I was playing a lot of Kaylee's from, I don't know, 2012, 2013, and I was doing a lot of science festivals, and in my head, over a pint after a Kaylee, the idea of the dashing white blood cell came to me. As you will, or the occasion strip the helix. And that ignited the idea of the beginning of what the science Kaylee might be. And that's literally developing dances that break down scientific concepts to explore complicated science. And working with researchers, working with community groups to come at it. And the idea was a bit of a kind of a gateway drug. So again, not expecting people to necessarily learn loads of science whilst they're dancing, but actually through the Kaylee event, bringing in new people who wouldn't necessarily call themselves scientists, who wouldn't go to a science lecture, or who wouldn't necessarily go to a talk, but they would instead of going to a Kaylee. And so it was a way of sparking conversations and bringing new people in. We were mildly successful in that. We were introducing 40-50% of our audiences who didn't normally go to science events. But again, I'm charting a bit of my relationship. So at the time, I guess my thinking of it, so that was our first Science Kaylees in 2014. And I guess what we were thinking about was, well, we bring them in with the Kaylee, we trick them with the culture and music and arts, and we throw in a wee bit of science just to break some ideas, to start conversations. And then we develop resources, which were funded by the Wellcome Trust, to help support the learning. So this is what ties to the curriculum. So I do actually have my fiddle. I just came from some filming in the National Museum of Scotland. Oh, if I don't blind you, what I might do is and reduce the sound. Is that possible? Give it a shot.
To start with, light hits a chlorophyll molecule inside something called photosystem.
I can't quite get it, so it's quite, that's very loud, isn't it? I can't use it because of the...
Oh, can you make it quieter here?
Oh no, because of the HDMI.
Oh.
Technical problems. Anyway, you can watch this in your own time. We've got lots of these videos. Anyway, but what we're showing here is our strict belief. So this is working. This is the videos that we hope to develop. Well, we leave as open source so people can learn and actually spend time learning about the research and how it links to the curriculum, for example. So it's a tool for learners. And so each of the dance moves, for example, is connected to a chemical reaction within photosynthesis. And together, can I get this to work?
Want to try?
Oh yeah, perfect, great. Oh, no. Okay, it's on this one, that's fine. No, it's not.
Yeah,
It's on that one now, great. It's not using quite so hard. There we go, excellent. So each of these steps are representing a part of the electron transport chain. We developed this with the chemist PhD actually. And then this goes to photosystem 1. So this is the chloroplast, the green part of a leaf. It goes down another electron transport chain, so this is a chemical reaction responding to the light that plants need. And then the second couple represents a second molecule, the first couple, I should say, NADP+, which is a molecular battery. So this reacts with the energy of the light, reacts with the water, which is the second couple. With that reaction, that releases 2 of the oxygen molecules and 2 electrons. And these electrons are recycled to begin the whole process again. So, and then if you watch the full video, this would then link to Jess's research, which she now has finally a doctorate, which is great, which is looking at how algae use photosynthesis as a way of blocking up carbon dioxide for climate change. And so we're using, I guess, again, art as a way of, I guess, breaking down and challenging perhaps stereotypes around science. But in terms of the development of the project, though, we're now an organisation, and we've been doing a lot of work working with different sectors. So what I would have thought as 2 years ago as a science education organisation, well, we've actually been thinking a little bit more about actually how we can go beyond that in terms of thinking about how do we build relationships with people who aren't the converted. And indeed, the older meaning of a Ceilidh is actually a gathering. It's just bringing people together. So this could be a Ceilidh as well. And it's about everyone feeling that they can share a piece. And that's really the spirit that we want to bring into science. If you've gone to a Ceilidh beforehand, you know you don't need to be the best dancer or the expert in the room. You don't need to be the best musician to be able to contribute, because it's all about bringing people together and giving people the space to feel like they are welcome and that their questions and their interests about the world are valid and interesting and important. And so this was really the big focus of the work we've been doing. And now actually, as an organisation, the Ceilidh bit is only a small part. It's only about 20–30% of the work we're doing. And again, we're trying to bring that broader spirit of Ceilidh, this idea of participation. How do you encourage people to feel welcome in the room? And so it's a lot of the work, especially because we were funded by a biomedical organisation, Wellcome Trust, was about exploring the biomedical sciences of everyday life. So using tools like my 3D printers of the brain, looking at dementia, and then in that case, the Ceilidh is just a way of bringing people together. But then actually, a lot of it is talking about how there's a lot of research around how creativity is good for helping increase mental well-being, or prevent, or bilingualism, or Gallic learning, or whatever it would be, is helping preventing dementia, for example. And so again, we're thinking about actually using arts in a very different way. We're not using it mechanistically anymore. It's not about using arts to teach science, but actually taking a much more community arts approach, which is all about relationships. And so this is one of the core tenets of our work. And I think it applies both in science education, arts education, heritage, but then also in political persuasions as well. Is a lot of the work we're doing is about building the relationship first. And it doesn't matter. So in those situations, we're not coming in as scientists, we're coming in as people who can connect because we can play music together, or we can share different words and dialects, or different versions of dances that we might have. And over time, we can build a relationship and build trust to truly understand a bit more about what these communities are interested in. And then again, instead of making communities accessible to researchers, we're thinking much more about how do we make researchers accessible to the communities. So flipping that power dynamic, that it's always us thinking about different communities and going in, how science, jazz hands, and whereas in reality, it might well be that if you're going in full first with the science, that you may be turning off the majority, or could be the majority of the population. And again, that's fine, it's about the ecosystem. There's really great events that go on which absolutely serve scientists, for example, and that's great, that's important. But I think we do need to be very reflective of, are we going beyond the echo chamber as well? How do we do that? And for us, a lot of it is about building trust and relationships first. Sometimes without that agenda, because sometimes they might not be interested in what you are interested in talking about. And so this is a good example where some of our work up in Shetland, and again, this is us thinking a bit more carefully as an organisation. So we went up there, we don't call ourselves a Science Ceilidh once we go up into communities, we co-create the name, because again, Science Ceilidh doesn't mean very much once you're out in traditions where Ceilidh or folk music is strong. And what's interesting is that we focus on creativity and well-being. There's a lot of work in Shetland going on about that. It's a very faraway place, and the winters are very long. But what was interesting was that not only the word science was the barrier to engagement, but the word Ceilidh itself as well. Because again, Shetland has one of the strongest and the oldest, I guess, cases of where Gaelic wasn't spoken in the same way, and so they would have much more of a Nordic tradition. And so the word that we used was a Shetlandic word that we developed again with community groups. It was spree, which was equivalent idea, so the evening of chats and connecting with your friends over music. And so this is one of our projects. And for this one, when you evaluated it, about 80% of our audiences, our participants, were also not likely to have gone to science events as well. But then we were celebrating how music and creativity generally is important for mental well-being, and we were supporting some of the local charities there too. So we've talked a bit about going beyond the converted. I guess more locally, a lot of the work we're doing is with the New Scots refugee community. And again, it's taken that kind of broader approach of science is in there, but very, very lightly. It's much more about cultural engagement, cultural sharing. So we've been doing a lot of work with part of British Science Week, for example, but then focusing a lot more on how we can learn from each other. A lot of the Syrian refugees, for example, beyond the label, I'm sure we as a community know all about labels, that Syrian refugees are scientists, and they are artists, and they are skilled people, and they are artisans, and they're everything. They're not just a refugee. And so a lot of the work we've been trying to do over the long term is thinking about how we can use culture and dance and cultural exchange and a wee bit of science. We're introducing engineers, for example, to some of the Syrian engineers, for example, so we can do a bit of a skill share together. And we can mix all that together so we can have a bit more cultural integration as well. And that's work is ongoing. And then, I guess one of the last thoughts that I've been thinking about a lot in the last year or two is there such thing as a neutral decision? And that applies to a lot of schoolwork, so we work a lot in schools. But in some ways, there is a gap. There's a gap between those who feel like they can engage in science and those who can't, those who believe that LGBT same-sex relationships are valuable and those who don't. And I guess in some ways, we have a real duty, because if you're not closing that gap, you're actually actively maintaining it. It's not a neutral decision. And again, that's not an attack, it's more of something I think that I used to reflect on, because no one can really be perfect about that. But again, there was no real neutral decision, there was real obligation for us to go beyond the already converted as well. We need to serve that and think about the diversity of that ecosystem, what we can provide, and what we need to do to listen. And again, interestingly, with a lot of the work we're doing in arts now, across sector, is that actually, again, we were very foolish. We were like, people don't engage in science, we're going to use arts. Arts are actually, especially certainly what we might consider high arts, proper arts, is equally elitist, if not even potentially more so. And so engagement in arts differs in terms of sectionality, in terms of race, for example, in terms of museums and galleries. How many people do you think have visited in the last year? Yeah, just shout out.
40?
So what percentage, sorry?
40%.
40, 60, 20? National Museum of Scotland? 47. So about half. There's still quite a big gap. Heritage, 75, so that's more, but that would probably define as things like tourism sites as well, would be included in that. Libraries? 40. 20, 40? Interesting. 36.5. What's interesting in libraries actually is one of the only cultural spaces where people from ethnic minority backgrounds actually use more than white. So it's an interesting intersection. And I guess the reason why I mentioned this one is also from the arts. I think there's a lot of work to be done in the sense of they've done a lot more thinking about diversity in some ways compared to science. Great that we have obviously organisations that are working with that in that space. They're not that much further ahead. So I think there's again a bit of an obligation from our point of view and a lot of work that we're trying to do on a more policy level to learn from the art sector to see where they're going in terms of what's worked and what importantly hasn't worked, so that we don't have to reinvent that wheel within science, for example. And also intersection is important. I mean, LGBTQ is overrepresented in art, for example, but ethnic minorities aren't. And so I think there's a really interesting point to be made there as well about who gets to be represented and who doesn't. And do we really just want, in terms of, for example, the very difficult conversation about class, for example, and there's a lot of work in class in the arts and not very much work in the class in STEM, for example. So we've got to be a bit, I guess, self-reflective that we don't just want the top 1% to be racially and gender and kind of sexuality diverse as well. We really need to think beyond that. I won't go through these. I'm going to finish. I guess the last thing I'm going to finish about is, I guess, one thing about the arts and a bit of a personal journey for me is that I never thought of myself as an ethnic minority until I started working cross-sector research around in the arts and I guess in science too. In the same way that in some ways I never really identified with LGBTQ in the same way up until I started thinking about the sector. Because all of a sudden when you think about coming from an ethnic minority, I guess in some ways, on some small way, your success of integration is that it's not a question. And so I remember a friend of mine was kind of like, oh, we're looking for people with ethnic minority backgrounds to talk about food. And I was like, oh God, okay, I'll talk to all the community groups that we work with and who is. And then she was like, oh yeah, what about you? And it was kind of a bit of a revelation for me personally, actually, because I am absolutely, my dad's a chef. I have lots of memories about food when my dad immigrated here into restaurants. But there's a little bit of an interesting tension for me, and I guess what's brought me all the way to this journey to coming out family to my dad is how it takes a long time to sometimes reflect above yourself. Sometimes when you come from a minority, you don't think, you kind of think of yourself as beyond that, because that's kind of how you succeed as a minority. You're a model minority, so racism has never been an issue, which has never been true. And same with sexuality as well. And so I think it's been a really interesting journey for me to start thinking myself as, and embracing, I guess, my ethnic minority status and my sexuality status as well. I'm going to finish there. The last thing about the cross-sector work is that it's all about structural change. That's the difference between racism and prejudice, right? It's not individual actions, though that is important. Same with climate change too. It's about the structural pressures. And so a lot of the work we're doing, hopefully forward-facing, is working structurally with schools. Because ultimately, it's all about education and how we can train, not just deliver in schools, but working with teachers and training to think about how we break down stereotypes around science, around arts, really, really importantly, creativity too, and then also in terms of all the diversity role models that we can provide. And there's only so much that you can ever deliver in schools yourself, so a lot of the work we're doing as a Science Ceilidh now, and I guess my outrageously ambitious but totally possible goal of the Science Ceilidh is that we've already worked in all these different parts of Scotland, and we want to work essentially with every single local authority in Scotland to provide training and the resources for teachers and eventually parents who sometimes harbour a lot of the stereotypes that they'll pass on to their kids, to be able to challenge those stereotypes of who can work in arts, who can work in science, and in fact it's not even about working, who science is relevant for, and who creativity is relevant for, and who diversity is relevant